Hey all, Chris Bassett here, and I'm going to be doing a rear tire change on my Sportster. Let's get into it. You'll want to support the motorcycle so that the rear wheel is off the ground. You can buy a motorcycle specific jack. I just used jack stands in my car jack. I put a car jack underneath the frame and then used a wooden block and positioned it and then used the jack stands on the foot pegs. That's the location where you'd want to put the jack. So yeah, there's a picture of a jack, and that would be where you position it underneath the bike to lift it off the ground. The rear wheel is pretty heavy and can be difficult to remove. Check the tire to ground clearance before removing the rear axle. You may want some help, or maybe place some wooden blocks under the tire. You'll want to remove the rear axle cotter pin, that way you can loosen up the axle nut. So here you can see the pin through the nut. It's bent around, so just unbend it and then drive it back out in reverse fashion. It's recommended to discard and replace with a new pin. I'm going to save it. The next step is to loosen the drive belt adjusting lock nuts and bolts. I would take measurements first because you're going to need to know where they're at, how long they are, and then the tensioning on your belt or chain. Write down that measurement. That way when you're putting everything back together, it makes it a little easier. Those lock nuts are 9/16. Go ahead and break them loose. Don't take them all the way out, just loosen them up. And then go ahead and loosen up both sides. Once those are loose, now you need to remove the axle nut and washer. You may need to put a wrench on the other side of the axle, that way it doesn't spin while you're trying to loosen it up. And then once everything is all loose, you can go ahead and take the axle out. I'd use a soft-faced mallet and tap it. If you're having trouble getting the axle out, try getting the weight off the wheel, and also you can use a punch. I used a steel rod that was about 2 foot long and a 1/2 inch diameter to finish punching out the axle. So here you can see the swing arm, the brake caliper, the spacer, and the brake disc, and that's how they're orientated with the axle. After a lot of cussing, you can see I finally pulled the axle out. Pretty dirty and corroded, so we're going to have to clean that up. WD-40 does really help if you're struggling to get the axle out. And there's that steel rod that I used as a punch to drive the axle through. Just be careful, if you're really beating on it, you can tear up the bearings. Make sure you identify the wheel spacers during the removal so you can return them to the original position when you reinstall. Next, you'll want to lift the drive chain or belt off the sprocket and remove the rear wheel. This can take quite a bit of muscling as there's tension on the belt. So move the wheel back and forth, up and down, until you can work the belt or chain off the sprocket. I got the belt off the tire, and then I went ahead and wiggled the tire from left to right and then slid it out underneath the left side of the motorcycle. Take out the valve core, that way you release all the air from your tire. I'm going to start changing the tire now. Definitely make note of which direction the rotation is on the tire and where your valve stem is at. That way you want to line up the new tire in the same direction of rotation, as well as there should be like a red or a yellow dot, and that is basically like where you want to put the valve stem. That's the factory's way of balancing your tire. I'd throw a towel on the ground so you don't damage your tire, and then use plenty of soapy water. I bought tire spoons off Amazon, and now I'm going to break the bead on the tire. I'll put links in the description to all the tools I used and the tires I bought. If you guys want to help support the channel, check out those links. So the idea is to basically pry the tire away from the rim. Use the curved side of the tire spoon as a lever, hook it underneath the rim, and then press down. The tire spoon kit does have like plastic guards to protect your rim. I'm not using them, but you should if you don't want to tear your rim up. Once you've broken the bead all around the tire, then you can start to pull the tire off by lifting it up and over the rim. Make sure you break the bead first, otherwise you're really going to fight it. And remember, plenty of soapy water. I can't stress that enough, how much easier it'll be if everything is really soapy. So continuously work in a circular fashion, moving the tire, inch by inch until you break one side off. At that point, it's pretty loose, and it should be much easier to pull the rest of the tire off. You can see I'm just prying underneath the rim now, and I'm going to go ahead and finish working my way around the edge, driving the rim out of the tire. When it gets to a certain point, it's just about out. You can just pull it out then, and pretty simple when you get to that spot. If you are having trouble getting the rim out, you can also heat the tire up, like throw it in the sun. It'll make it a little more pliable and easier to work with. So now that the rim is out of the tire, we're going to throw the new tire on. Definitely make sure the rotation is the same direction, as well as that dot that lines up with your valve stem to use as a balancing tool. I use the 130/90/16s for my rear tire. Like I said, link in the description. All right, go ahead and line up your rotation and your valve stem, and then you'll want to drive the rim into the tire. Get ready to do a lot of cussing. Soapy water's definitely going to help. You want to make sure that you seat one side of the tire first by working the spoons back and forth and getting just, half of the tire put into place. Once you get the tire halfway in, you can see I'm using my legs as well to lean on one side and then pry on the other side. You'll just keep working it around, extra soapy water and a lot of cursing. Eventually you'll get the tire seated, and then you can flip it over and do the other side. One thing to be mindful of is if you actually set the bead on one side or on the bottom side while you're trying to finish off the top, it'll be much more difficult. So make sure that that tire isn't completely in the bead. It'll save you a lot of extra groaning and grunting. And it does say all models are cast wheels, so you won't need to worry about an inner tube or anything like that. With the tire successfully on the wheel, go ahead and air up your tire to 36 psi. It's time to reinstall the tire, so go ahead and position the tire under the bike, and then you may need to use some blocks of wood or like a lift or something, or an extra helper to lift the tire up into place, and then reinstall your chain or drive belt around the sprocket. It does make it a lot easier if everything's perfectly lined up before you start to put the axle in place and the spacers and the brake caliper. Here's the rear brake caliper. We're going to go ahead and slide that in next. There's a lip on the caliper which just kind of attaches to the swing arm, and then you can position it so that the axle can slide through the hole of the brake caliper. Don't be afraid to kind of wiggle it around or tap it with a hammer gently to get it into position. I'd go ahead and line up your spacers, the small spacer on the left and the thicker spacer on the right. Make sure you clean the axle thoroughly and then apply some waterproof bearing grease prior to installation. Then go ahead and slide the axle in from the right side, and you may need to tap it or drive it in while you're kind of moving the wheels around, jostling it to get it to force all the way through. Some ideas could be like maybe a jack underneath it, or I used like a makeshift lever where I used my foot to kind of lift up the wheel into place. So here's everything in order. Got your axle nut, the washer, the adjuster bolt, your brake caliper, your small spacer, then your brake disc, and then you got the bearing inside, and then through the middle of the bearing comes out the other side. Then you got your belt or chain sprocket, the thicker spacer, the right hand side adjuster bolt and lock nut, and then the axle itself. Now this is the part where you adjust the chain or belt with the tension on those adjuster bolts. Since I have a belt on my bike, I'm just going to go over the belt procedure. So we're looking to position the wheel so that when 10 pounds of force is applied to the belt, it only has a deflection of like 9/16 of an inch. You can purchase a belt tension gauge that applies 10 pounds off Amazon, but here's the window location. Let me shine some light on it, and you'll be able to see there's that gauge right there. Now, when from the underside, if you push up on it, you can see the belt move, anywhere from ½ inch to ½ inch, however much tension is on the belt, how tight it is. So there's the figure, what you're looking for. If you push up with 10 pounds of force, the belt shouldn't move more than 9/16 of an inch. So in order to make the belt tighter, you will draw those tensioner bolts out. It basically pulls the wheel away from the motorcycle, making the belt tighter. So right there you can see the models, and mine says 9/16. You can pause the chart and then check yours. But then you'll want to tighten up those bolts. That's one reason we took measurements before we took everything apart, was that way you can kind of have a rough idea of where it needs to be. And then you want to make sure that both sides are symmetrical. So whether it's like 1 3/8 or whatever measurement you have, make sure they're the same. When adjusting the belt, only turn the nuts like 1/4 to 1/2 turn each time before you then try to push up on the belt to check the tension. Also keep in mind that the little notches on your window, each dash represents 1/8 of an inch. So the rear wheel must be properly aligned, otherwise the belt could cause rapid or uneven wear. Once the rear wheel is adjusted properly, you'll want to tighten down the axle nut. It requires 60 to 65 foot-pounds of torque. You'll then install a new cotter pin and then rotate the wheel several times to make sure it rotates freely and that the brakes work properly. Hey, check out this other video right here. I put links in the description for the parts, so check that out. If you have any questions, put it down in the comments, and if this was helpful, hit the like button. Thanks.